Murder at the Robotics competition. Welcome back to Mindful Musings, where William brings you stories of mystery and intrigue that unfold like the perfect puzzle. I'm your host, William, and today we're stepping into a world of circuits, ambition, and secrets as we follow Miss Marple through a murder at the Lakewood Heights High School Robotics Championship. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you are in the world as you listen to this tale. Are you somewhere quiet with a cup of tea, or perhaps in the middle of your evening routine? Whatever the case, I hope you'll join us as Miss Marple untangles the wires of deception in this modern mystery. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Championship Assembly. The gymnasium at Lakewood Heights High School buzzed with an electric energy that had nothing to do with the elaborate robots displayed across the competition floor. Miss Marple, invited as a distinguished guest to judge the innovation category, sat in the observation booth with her, knitting needles clicking softly as she surveyed the scene below. At 83 years old, she found that robotics competitions were not so different from the human dramas she had observed in St. Mary Mead all these decades. The machines might be new, but the motivations behind them were as ancient as time itself. The gymnasium had been transformed into a showcase of teenage ingenuity. 12 robots of varying sizes and complexity were positioned at stations throughout the space. Some were sleek and minimalist, built for speed and precision. Others were more elaborate, bristling with sensors and articulated limbs. The competing teams stood near their creations, speaking in hushed, nervous tones as judges moved from station to station, making notes on their clipboards. Dr. Jonathan Ashford, the faculty advisor for the Lakewood Heights Robotics Club and head of the school's Science and Technology department, moved through the gymnasium with an ease that suggested this was his domain. At 56, he possessed the kind of polished confidence that came from years of institutional authority. His tailored blazer and expensive watch spoke of a man who had done well for himself, far better perhaps than a high school teacher should have done on his modest salary. Miss Marple observed him with particular interest as he paused at each station, offering comments to the students that ranged from encouraging to dismissive. When he reached the station overseen by a petite young woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, his expression shifted to something more guarded. The girl's name, according to the program, was Sarah Chen. Her robot, designated Project Catalyst, was unlike anything else on display. Its design was elegant and efficient, featuring an innovative power distribution system that seemed to anticipate the very future of robotics. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as Dr. Ashford examined her creation, his eyes lingering longer than they had at any other station. "Ambitious work," he said finally, his tone measured and careful. "Where did you source your design inspiration?" Sarah's reply was barely audible. "It's my own design, Dr. Ashford. I spent months developing the circuitry." Dr. Ashford smiled, but it was a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Of course. Well, we shall see how it performs in the elimination rounds." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. There was something in that exchange, some current beneath the surface pleasantry, that suggested a history between the teacher and this student. She made a mental note, as she had learned to do over many decades of observation, that this particular interaction deserved closer attention. The morning's preliminary tests proceeded smoothly enough. The robots navigated obstacle courses, demonstrated their specialized functions, and showcased their design innovations. Sarah Chen's Project Catalyst performed flawlessly, moving through its testing sequence with a precision that drew murmurs of admiration from other students and judges alike. Yet throughout the morning, Miss Marple noticed something troubling. Each time Sarah's robot earned praise from the judges, Dr. Ashford's expression darkened slightly, becoming more guarded. During the lunch break, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Dr. Ashford at the refreshment table. She had learned long ago that seemingly innocent chatter could reveal much about a person's true nature. "Remarkable young minds you've cultivated here," Miss Marple remarked, accepting a cup of tea from a student volunteer. "That young woman, Sarah Chen, her robot seems particularly innovative." Dr. Ashford stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Marple, you're very observant. Yes, Sarah is talented, though I suspect she may have had more guidance than she initially revealed. Students sometimes oversimplify their design process to appear more independent than they are." "How interesting," Miss Marple replied mildly. "In my experience, young people are generally quite honest about their work, particularly when they're proud of it." Another judge, a woman named Dr. Patricia Owens, who represented a major technology corporation, joined them at the table. She was studying her program intently, a slight frown on her face. "I've been meaning to speak with you, Jonathan," Dr. Owens said. "I'm quite impressed with some of the designs I've seen today. In fact, several of them seem remarkably similar to designs that have been patented by my company over the past 3 years, particularly the power distribution innovation on that Project Catalyst device." Dr. Ashford's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "Perhaps there's simply convergent evolution in robotics thinking, Dr. Owens. Multiple people working on similar problems sometimes arrive at similar solutions." Dr. Owens regarded him thoughtfully. "Perhaps, though I find it curious that these solutions always seem to emerge from your robotics team, and only after they've been in your program for some time." She paused, studying his face. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, Jonathan?" The tension between the two of them was palpable, and Miss Marple continued to knit, her needles clicking steadily as her keen blue eyes missed nothing. Before Dr. Ashford could respond, the lunch period ended, and students began returning to the gymnasium for the afternoon elimination rounds. The afternoon session proceeded with increasing intensity. The remaining robots were tested in more complex scenarios, and the field began to narrow. By late afternoon, only 4 robots remained in contention, including Sarah Chen's Project Catalyst. The final test would be a comprehensive functionality assessment, where each robot would be examined in detail by the judges, its circuitry inspected, its engineering validated. It was during this final phase that Miss Marple observed something quite peculiar. Dr. Ashford had positioned himself near Sarah's robot, and when the other judges and students stepped away briefly to record their scores, he leaned very close to the device, examining its internal circuitry with unusual intensity. His expression was difficult to read, but Miss Marple detected something akin to anger, or perhaps fear, in the tightness around his mouth. The final judging process would take place after closing that evening, with the awards announced the following morning. As the crowd began to disperse and students carefully packed away their robots, Miss Marple found herself approached by a young man who appeared to be a student, though she didn't immediately recognize him from the competition. "Excuse me, Miss Marple," he said hesitantly. "I'm Marcus Webb. I'm on the robotics team, though I'm not competing this year because I'm graduating. I wondered if you might have a moment to speak with me." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Of course, Marcus. What is it that troubles you?" Marcus glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "I think something inappropriate has been happening in our robotics program. I'm not certain how to explain it without sounding paranoid, but several of us have noticed that our best designs seem to end up in patents filed by Dr. Ashford's name, or sometimes sold to corporations. Sarah Chen, who's competing today, she's been particularly troubled by this. Her original design for an improved robot navigation system was incorporated into a patent that was filed with her work cited only as technical research." "How very curious," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "Has Sarah spoken to Dr. Ashford about this situation?" "She tried to once," Marcus said quietly. "He told her that teachers have a responsibility to monetize student work for the benefit of the program, though I don't know how much money from those patents has actually come back to support us. After that, she stopped bringing her best ideas to him." Miss Marple's expression grew more serious. "And how long has this been occurring, Marcus?" "At least 2 years that I know of, possibly longer. But it's gotten worse recently. Sarah's design for Project Catalyst is unlike anything she's ever created, and if Dr. Ashford patents it, it could be worth millions. She applied for college scholarships based on her reputation as an innovative designer, but some of those scholarships got redirected when her earlier work started appearing in patents filed by someone else." As Marcus walked away, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The threads of this mystery were beginning to reveal a pattern that extended far beyond a simple robotics competition. She had seen many variations of human ambition and betrayal in her long life, but the cruelty of stealing from the young, of robbing them of their rightful recognition and opportunity, struck her with particular force. That evening, as she returned to her modest hotel room, Miss Marple found herself unable to focus on her knitting. She telephoned the local police station and asked to speak with Inspector Raymond, who had become an old friend over the years through various unfortunate incidents. "Inspector, I'm attending the Robotics Championship at Lakewood Heights," she said without preamble. "I'm afraid I may need your assistance. There appears to be a situation involving theft of intellectual property that may require investigation." Inspector Raymond listened carefully as she explained the situation, her concerns about Dr. Ashford, and the details Marcus had provided. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. "Miss Marple, these are serious allegations," he said finally, "but they're civil matters at this point, not criminal ones. Intellectual property disputes require lawyers and documentation, not police intervention." "I understand, Inspector," Miss Marple replied. "However, I have a rather strong feeling that this matter may become considerably more serious before the competition ends. I wonder if you might simply be available should the need arise." There was a note in her voice, a particular certainty born of decades of solving mysteries, that gave the inspector pause. "I'll be available," he said. "But please do be careful, Miss Marple. If there's genuine criminal activity occurring, you mustn't take unnecessary risks." Miss Marple smiled to herself as she hung up the telephone. She had no intention of taking unnecessary risks, but she had also learned that sometimes placing oneself in a position to observe could be the greatest risk of all. Chapter 2. The Inspection Hour. The morning of the final judging dawned grey and cold. Miss Marple arrived at the gymnasium early, wanting to observe the space before it filled with the usual crowd of students, parents, and staff members. She found herself nearly alone in the cavernous room, with only the robots standing silent on their pedestals, inert, machines awaiting the purpose their creators had designed them to fulfill. She paused at Sarah Chen's Project Catalyst, examining it with the detailed attention she might have given to a piece of fine embroidery. The design was indeed remarkable. Every component was precisely placed, every circuit routed with logical efficiency. This was the work of a young mind with both technical skill and artistic sensibility. It deserved recognition and protection, not theft and exploitation. The gymnasium began to fill as the morning progressed. By 9 o'clock, when the final round of judging was scheduled to commence, the space was crowded with competitors, their families, school administrators, and a surprising number of representatives from major technology corporations. Dr. Owens was present, as were several other corporate judges. They moved through the gymnasium with the purposeful air of people who were here not merely to judge a school competition, but to scout for promising technologies they might incorporate into their own product lines. The plan for the day was straightforward enough. Each remaining robot would undergo a comprehensive technical inspection, with judges examining the internal circuitry, testing the functionality of various components, and asking the student designers detailed questions about their design choices. The top 3 robots would be selected based on innovation, functionality, and execution. The winner would receive a substantial scholarship, and the second and third place finishers would also receive educational awards. As the judges assembled, Miss Marple noticed that Dr. Ashford had positioned himself as the lead inspector for the technical evaluation. He would be the first judge to handle each robot, examining it in detail before other judges took their turn. This seemed like an unusual arrangement, and Miss Marple made note of it with particular interest. The first 3 robots were inspected without incident, though Miss Marple observed Dr. Ashford examining each one with careful attention to its power distribution systems. When Sarah Chen's Project Catalyst was rolled forward for inspection, a subtle shift occurred in the gymnasium's atmosphere. Students from the Lakewood Heights team leaned forward with evident pride and nervousness. Sarah herself stood very still, her hands clenched in her pockets. Dr. Ashford approached the robot with deliberate slowness. He circled it once, studying its external design. Then, reaching out his hand, he grasped the robot's main access panel, preparing to open it for internal inspection. What happened next occurred in a fraction of a second, too quickly for most observers to fully process. There was a sharp crackling sound, a sound like electricity arcing through air. Dr. Ashford's body went rigid, his muscles contracting involuntarily. He fell backward with a terrible cry, his hand still extended toward the robot as though in a final gesture of accusation. The gymnasium erupted into chaos. Students screamed. Parents rushed toward the space where Dr. Ashford lay convulsing on the gymnasium floor. One of the school's administrators shouted for someone to call an ambulance. A science teacher who had some medical training attempted CPR, though it was quickly apparent that such efforts would be futile. Dr. Jonathan Ashford was dead before the ambulance arrived, killed by an electrical current of lethal voltage that had been deliberately conducted through the robot's external chassis. And at the centre of the gymnasium, Sarah Chen's Project Catalyst stood silent and inert, its true purpose no longer the safe advancement of robotics innovation, but the instrument of its creator's unintended death. Miss Marple sat perfectly still in her observer's chair, her knitting needles having frozen mid-stitch. She had come to the gymnasium this morning expecting complications, but even her long experience with human darkness had not quite prepared her for violence of this magnitude, and violence that seemed to implicate the one person she had been specifically moved to protect. Police arrived within minutes, led by Inspector Raymond himself, who seemed unsurprised to find Miss Marple at the scene of yet another crime. As officers began cordoning off the gymnasium and directing students and parents toward the exits, he made his way to her observation booth. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I'm not entirely surprised to find you here, though I confess I'd hoped your intuitions might have been mistaken this time." "As had I, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, setting down her knitting, "though I suspect my concerns, while relevant to this tragedy, may not have addressed the true nature of the danger." As the gymnasium was cleared and forensic teams began their preliminary investigation of the robot, Inspector Raymond established a temporary command centre in the school's administrative offices. He requested that Miss Marple remain available for questioning, though given their long history, this was more courtesy than demand. The preliminary investigation revealed several crucial facts. The robot's electrical system had been deliberately modified to conduct lethal voltage through its external chassis. The modifications showed considerable technical sophistication, indicating that whoever had made them understood electrical systems and circuitry in detail. Moreover, whoever had made these modifications would have known that Dr. Ashford would be the first judge to conduct an intensive physical inspection of the robot. This was not a crime of passion, Miss Marple reflected. This was a crime of calculation and deliberate planning. By evening, as darkness fell over the school, the initial phase of the investigation had yielded several important pieces of evidence. The electrical modifications to the robot's circuitry were identified and carefully documented. Security footage from the gymnasium showed that Sarah Chen had been alone with her robot late the previous evening, after all other students had left the building. The footage showed her working on the robot's internal components for nearly 40 minutes. When Inspector Raymond presented this information to Miss Marple in a quiet corner of the administrative office, he allowed his frustration to show. "The evidence seems to point directly at the girl," he said. "Sarah Chen had access and opportunity. She was seen working on the robot late last night, which would have given her time to make the electrical modifications. And according to what you've told me about Dr. Ashford's theft of her designs, she had clear motive." "All true, Inspector," Miss Marple agreed. "And yet, I find myself deeply uncertain about whether Sarah is truly our perpetrator." "Why?" Raymond asked directly. "What am I missing?" Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment, her ancient blue eyes distant with thought. "Because, Inspector, I observed Sarah's face when Dr. Ashford fell. I've studied human reactions to violence for a very long time, and what I saw in her expression was not satisfaction or grim justification, but genuine shock and horror. Moreover, the girl is far too intelligent to leave herself so obviously implicated by the security footage." Chapter 3. The Circuits of Betrayal. The initial phase of the police investigation proceeded along conventional lines. Sarah Chen was questioned extensively, and while she initially maintained her innocence, the weight of the evidence against her was difficult to refute. She had been alone with her robot the previous evening. The electrical modifications to its circuitry bore a sophistication that suggested they were made by someone with deep understanding of robotics and circuitry. And she undoubtedly had motive, having had her designs stolen by the very man now dead. Yet, as Miss Marple had observed, something about the case did not quite fit the neat narrative that the evidence seemed to suggest. She requested permission from Inspector Raymond to conduct her own interviews with the key participants in the robotics program, and given their long partnership, he He reluctantly agreed. Her first interview was with Sarah herself. Miss Marple visited her in the school's guidance counsellor's office, where the girl had been temporarily relocated while her home and computer were being searched by police. Sarah's eyes were red from crying, and her entire frame seemed diminished by the weight of suspicion. She looked up hopefully when Miss Marple entered, but the older woman could see the resignation in her face, the sense that everyone had already concluded her guilt. "Sarah, I want you to tell me about your visit to the gymnasium last evening," Miss Marple said without preamble. "Not what the police have suggested you did, but precisely what you actually did while you were there with your robot." Sarah's voice was hollow. "I was adjusting the power distribution, connections. My robot had performed well during the preliminary tests, but I noticed some minor inefficiencies in the power flow. I wanted to optimize the circuit before the final judging. I was there from 7 in the evening until perhaps 8:15. "And did you examine every component of the power system?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Sarah replied. "I only worked on the battery connection interface and the primary distribution circuit. The secondary systems I didn't touch because they had performed well enough during the testing." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, is it possible that someone could have modified the secondary electrical systems without your knowledge?" Sarah's eyes widened. I don't know. I wasn't there the entire time. At one point I went to get some tools from the engineering classroom. I must have been gone for 5 minutes, perhaps a bit longer. Anyone could have accessed the robot while I was away." This was precisely the sort of detail that Miss Marple had suspected. She thanked Sarah and assured her that she was working to clarify matters, though she was careful not to make promises she couldn't necessarily keep. Her next interview was with Dr. Patricia Owens, the corporate judge who had expressed concerns about the suspicious similarities between student designs and corporate patents. Miss Marple met with her at the hotel where she was staying, a modest but comfortable establishment near the school. Dr. Owens received her with professional courtesy, though there was a wariness in her expression that suggested she was accustomed to difficult conversations. "Dr. Owens, I'm curious about your interaction with Dr. Ashford regarding the similarities between your company's patents and the student designs," Miss Marple began. "Had you raised these concerns with him before the competition began?" "Yes," Dr. Owens replied carefully. "I had actually contacted him several weeks ago with questions about how designs from his students were ending up in our patent database with his name as the primary inventor. It was an extremely awkward conversation. He became defensive and suggested that I was being paranoid and protectionist." "And what did you intend to do with these concerns?" Miss Marple asked. Dr. Owens sighed. "Frankly, I was planning to discuss the matter with the school's administration after the competition concluded. I was also considering reporting the situation to the Technology Ethics Board at the International Engineering Association. What Dr. Ashford was doing was not merely theft, Miss Marple. It was an abuse of a position of authority over young people who couldn't protect themselves." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did you communicate your intentions to anyone else?" "Only to my assistant, who was with me at the competition," Dr. Owens said. Miss Marple's final interview before the evening concluded was with Marcus Webb, the graduating student who had first alerted her to the problem of stolen designs. She found him in the robotics laboratory, where he was attempting to continue work on his own project despite the pall that had fallen over the entire department. "Marcus, I want to ask you about the evening before the competition's final day," Miss Marple said. "Were you in the school at any point during the evening?" Marcus hesitated. "Yes, actually. I came back around 7 o'clock to work on my own robot. I had some final refinements I wanted to make. I was in the engineering lab for maybe an hour." "And did you see anyone else in the school during that time?" Miss Marple pressed. Marcus thought carefully. "I saw Sarah going toward the gymnasium around 7:15, and I think I saw someone else, but I'm not completely certain. There's a back entrance to the school that lots of people use. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and I glimpsed someone moving quickly past the lab window, but I didn't get a clear view of who it was." "Could it have been Dr. Ashford?" Miss Marple asked. "Possibly," Marcus said uncertainly, "but it seemed like someone younger from what I could see. It's hard to say for sure." As Miss Marple left the school that evening, the darkness of the night seemed to mirror the darkness of the mystery that surrounded her. The evidence against Sarah was circumstantial but compelling, yet Miss Marple's decades of experience had taught her that the most obvious suspect is often not the true guilty party, merely a convenient vessel for suspicion. Chapter 4. The Hidden Transactions. Inspector Raymond provided Miss Marple with access to the preliminary forensic findings, an unusual arrangement, but one born of their long collaboration. What she discovered in the financial records of Dr. Ashford revealed a pattern that suggested his theft of student designs had been far more systematic and profitable than anyone had initially understood. Over the past 5 years, Dr. Ashford had filed 17 patents, all ostensibly based on his own research, but all containing innovations that closely mirrored designs created by his robotics students. The patents had been licensed to various technology corporations, generating well over $2 million in licensing fees. The vast majority of this money appeared to have gone directly into Dr. Ashford's personal accounts. Miss Marple noted that only a small fraction, perhaps 5%, had been directed towards supporting the school's robotics program. But what was even more interesting was that Dr. Ashford had been planning to patent Sarah Chen's Project Catalyst design the moment the competition concluded. Documents found on his personal computer indicated that he had already drafted the patent application, listed himself as the primary inventor, with Sarah's contribution acknowledged only as technical research assistance. He had estimated the value of this patent at approximately $3 million. What was perhaps most troubling was that this patent would likely invalidate a scholarship that Sarah had already been awarded, based on her reputation as an independent innovator. The scholarship committee had begun investigating her eligibility the moment questions about her design's originality had surfaced. One email from a scholarship administrator, dated just 1 week before the competition, suggested that Sarah's scholarship would almost certainly be revoked if her designs were found to be insufficiently original. Miss Marple shared these findings with Inspector Raymond, and she observed with interest how his face changed as he read through the documentation. "This is far worse than simple intellectual property theft," Raymond said grimly. "This is fraud on a significant scale, and worse, it appears to have had a direct and devastating impact on Sarah Chen's future prospects. The scholarship she was counting on for college has been jeopardized because of his theft, which provides her with perhaps the strongest motive imaginable," Miss Marple observed quietly. "A young person's entire future derailed by the greed and dishonesty of someone in a position of authority over her. It's the sort of motivation that might drive someone to do something they would never otherwise contemplate." "Yes," Raymond said heavily, "which makes her the most likely suspect, no matter how uncomfortable that makes us both." Yet Miss Marple continued to harbour doubts that she could not entirely articulate. She spent the following day conducting a more detailed examination of the robotics laboratory and the gymnasium, studying the crime scene photographs and the technical documentation of how the electrical modifications had been made. The modifications were sophisticated, but not extraordinarily so. Someone with a solid understanding of electrical circuits could have made them, but they didn't require the sort of genius-level expertise that Sarah Chen possessed. In fact, Miss Marple noted that there were subtle inefficiencies in the wiring that a truly expert designer would likely have avoided. These modifications had been made by someone competent but not exceptional. She was examining the technical drawings of the robot's electrical system when she noticed something curious. The electrical circuit that had been modified to create the lethal voltage was not part of Project Catalyst's primary system design. It was a secondary power system that Sarah had mentioned not having worked on during her evening visit to the gymnasium. Whoever had modified this system would have needed to know where it was located and understand its purpose. In other words, they would have needed to be familiar with Sarah's design in considerable detail before making the modifications. And there were precious few people in the school who fit that description. Sarah herself, certainly. The robotics club members who had seen her work, and Dr. Ashford, who had examined the robot carefully just before his death. But there was one other person who would have had both the technical knowledge and the access to the robot's design specifications. Miss Marple requested a meeting with the school's administrator, Mrs. Helen Summers, who managed the robotics competition and had overseen the logistics of the event. Mrs. Summers was a woman in her late 40s, efficient and professional, who seemed genuinely distressed by the death of Dr. Ashford and the shadow it had cast over the school. Mrs. Summers, I'm curious about the security arrangements for the gymnasium during the evening hours, Miss Marple began. Who had access to the building after regular school hours? Well, several people, Mrs. Summers replied. The school custodian had a key, of course. The Robotics Club members had a key that was issued to the team captain. Dr. Ashford had a key. Several faculty members who worked late had keys to the building. And who was the robotics team captain this year? Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. That would be Marcus Webb, Mrs. Summers said. He's been instrumental in the programme for the past 3 years. This information gave Miss Marple considerable pause. Marcus Webb had been in the school during the evening hours when the modifications might have been made. He had opportunity and access. But did he have motive? Miss Marple requested a second interview with Marcus, this time being considerably more direct in her questioning. Marcus, I want to ask you about your relationship with Dr. Ashford, she said, without preamble. Beyond the general awareness that he was stealing designs, was there any personal conflict between you two? Marcus's face darkened. Yes, actually. Dr. Ashford took a design I created for a specialized robotic arm 3 years ago. It was supposed to be the centerpiece of my college application. The design was elegant and innovative, and it demonstrated a genuine understanding of mechanical engineering principles. Dr. Ashford patented it without my permission, licensed it to a manufacturing company, and made over $200,000 from the licensing fees. I received nothing. And what happened when you confronted him about this? Miss Marple asked. I tried to, Marcus said bitterly. He told me that teachers have a right to use student work created in school programs to advance their own research. He said that my understanding of intellectual property law was immature and naive. He essentially told me that there was nothing I could do about it. Did you take the matter to the school administration? Miss Marple pressed. I tried, Marcus said, his voice hollow. But Dr. Ashford was well liked by the administration, and my complaint was treated as a student being sour about teacher authority. It went nowhere. Miss Marple sat quietly for a moment, studying the young man's face. She could see the anger there, the resentment at having been wronged, the frustration of being unable to obtain justice through legitimate channels. These were powerful emotions, the sort that might drive a young person to desperate actions. Marcus, she asked very gently, were you in the gymnasium at any point during the evening before the final competition? Marcus met her eyes. No, Miss Marple. I was in the engineering lab working on my own project. I saw Sarah going toward the gymnasium, but I didn't follow her, and I didn't go there myself. Miss Marple believed him, though she couldn't have articulated precisely why. There was a quality of resigned honesty in his voice, the tone of someone who had learned that fighting against injustice was ultimately futile, and who had therefore settled into a kind of grim acceptance. Chapter 5. The Programming Error. As Miss Marple delved deeper into the technical aspects of the case, she found herself studying the electrical modifications with increasing attention. She requested access to the robots, circuit board, and, with Inspector Raymond's reluctant permission, was allowed to examine it carefully in the presence of a forensic technician. What she discovered was deeply revealing. The modifications to the electrical system showed signs of having been made by someone learning the process, someone who had consulted instructions or schematics very carefully, but who lacked the intuitive understanding that came from years of practice. There were hesitation marks in the circuit routing, places where the designer had second-guessed their work. There were components that had been replaced with alternative parts, suggesting that the original installer had made mistakes and had to correct them. Moreover, the electrical modifications were crude in a way that seemed inconsistent with Sarah Chen's demonstrated expertise. Sarah's work on Project Catalyst showed every indication of someone who understood not just how to make circuits work, but why they worked, who could optimize and streamline her designs with the unconscious ease of true mastery. The modifications to the electrical system showed none of this elegance. These modifications weren't made by someone with exceptional skill, Miss Marple explained to Inspector Raymond. They were made by someone with adequate technical knowledge but limited experience, someone who followed instructions or diagrams but didn't truly understand the underlying principles. Which could still be Sarah, Raymond pointed out. She might have deliberately created the modifications in a clumsy way to throw suspicion away from herself. Possible, Miss Marple conceded, but it would be a significant departure from her demonstrated character. She is a proud designer, someone who takes satisfaction in the elegance of her work. It seems unlikely that she would create something so poorly crafted, even for deceptive purposes. At this point, Miss Marple decided to expand her investigation to include other members of the Robotics program. She spent time observing the students who were members of the club, watching how they interacted with one another and with the equipment in the robotics lab. It was during one of these observations that she noticed something unusual about the way one particular student, a junior named James Whitmore, approached the circuit boards and electrical components. James was not one of the competition team members, but rather someone who had expressed interest in joining the robotics club next year. He spent considerable time in the lab, ostensibly learning from the more experienced students, but Miss Marple observed that he was studying the equipment with unusual intensity, making notes about the electrical systems and asking frequent questions about how the various components were connected. Moreover, she noticed that James had been particularly attentive during a conversation between two senior students about how Sarah's robot's secondary electrical system worked. He had asked detailed questions, written down explanations, and seemed to be absorbing information about the specific technical features that had later been modified to become lethal. Miss Marple arranged to speak with James in the robotics lab after school hours, when the space was nearly empty. "James, I've noticed that you seem particularly interested in electrical systems," Miss Marple observed, settling herself into a chair near his workstation. James looked startled at her sudden appearance. "Yes, Miss Marple. I'm hoping to join the robotics team next year, and I wanted to understand the technical aspects of the work." "That's admirable," Miss Marple said. "Tell me, how long have you been interested in robotics?" "Only since this year," James replied. "I transferred to Lakewood Heights at the beginning of this semester. Before that, I was attending Franklin High School, where they don't have a robotics program." "Why did you transfer?" Miss Marple asked. James hesitated. "My family wanted me in a school with stronger STEM programs. They're hoping I'll be able to get into a top engineering college." "I see," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "James, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me truthfully. Were you in the school at any time during the evening before the final competition?" James's face paled. He opened his mouth as if to lie, then seemed to think better of it. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "I was here, but I didn't do anything wrong." "Tell me exactly what you were doing," Miss Marple said gently. James looked down at his hands. "I was in the robotics lab. I'd been thinking about Project Catalyst, about how elegant Sarah's design was. I wanted to examine her circuit diagrams more carefully, to understand how she had approached the problem of power distribution. I knew the lab had copies of all the team's design files." "And did you examine Sarah's files?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes," James said. "I printed out her electrical schematics and studied them for maybe an hour. I was fascinated by the innovation she had demonstrated." "Did you go near her robot while you were in the school?" Miss Marple asked. James hesitated, and his hesitation told Miss Marple more than words could have. Yes, I did go into the gymnasium briefly, just to look at it. I promise. I didn't touch anything. I just wanted to see how the design translated into the physical construction." "And you didn't notice anything unusual about the robot?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "No, nothing. I was only there for a few minutes," James said. Then his expression changed, and realization seemed to dawn on him. "Wait, you think I modified the robot? You think I killed Dr. Ashford?" "Did you?" Miss Marple asked directly. "No, God no, I would never. I didn't even know how to modify an electrical system like that. I've been studying robotics for only a few weeks. I don't have the kind of knowledge required to do something so dangerous." Miss Marple studied his face carefully. She had interviewed many people in her life, and she had learned to distinguish between the panic of the falsely accused and the guilt of the truly culpable. What she saw in James's expression was genuine distress at being suspected, but no sign of genuine guilt regarding the actual crime. "I believe you," Miss Marple said finally, "but I think you should tell Inspector Raymond everything you've just told me. Transparency in an investigation is always preferable to secrecy." Chapter 6. The Anonymous Assistants. As the investigation continued to circle around Sarah Chen with little progress toward definitive proof one way or another, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the nature of the crime itself. Someone had deliberately modified the robot to deliver lethal voltage to Dr. Ashford. This required not just knowledge of electrical systems, but knowledge of Dr. Ashford's inspection procedures, his intended timing, and his typical approach to handling unfamiliar equipment. It also required access to the robot in the gymnasium during a specific window of time, access that wouldn't immediately be noticed or questioned. Sarah Chen had such access, it was true, but so did several others. Inspector Raymond had been working primarily from the assumption that Sarah was the perpetrator, but even he was beginning to harbour doubts when the forensic evidence failed to provide definitive proof beyond the security footage of her working on her robot. It was during one of Miss Marple's evening visits to the school, when she was examining the gymnasium in the fading light of late afternoon, that she discovered something that changed her understanding of the case significantly. The security camera that had recorded Sarah working on her robot had a blind spot, a portion of the gymnasium that was not visible in the camera's field of view. This blind spot was precisely where the robot had been stationed for the evening. Someone clever enough might have moved the robot into this blind spot, while Sarah was away getting tools, made the modifications, and then moved it back before Sarah returned. But more importantly, Miss Marple discovered that the security system had been accessed and modified sometime during the day of the competition. A review of the system logs showed that someone with the administrator's password had accessed the security system and changed which cameras were actively recording. The change had been made in a way that would ensure Sarah's actions were recorded, but the actions of anyone else who approached the robot during her absence would not be. This discovery pointed to someone with administrative access to the school's security systems. Miss Marple immediately reviewed the list of people with such access and found it contained 3 names: the school's principal, the head of security, and the school's technology administrator. Miss Marple's investigation took an unexpected turn when she discovered that the school's technology administrator, a man named Robert Keane, had recently experienced significant financial difficulties. His gambling debts had mounted to over $100,000, and he was facing serious consequences from creditors. Moreover, she discovered that Dr. Ashford had apparently discovered Keane's situation, and rather than reporting it to the administration, had offered him a proposition. In exchange for assistance in covering his tracks regarding the patent thefts, Keane would receive a percentage of the licensing fees from Dr. Ashford's stolen designs. Armed with this information, Miss Marple arranged a meeting with Robert Keane in the school's technology office. "Mr. Keane, I've been investigating the modifications to the security system that occurred during the day of the robotics competition," Miss Marple said, without preamble. "The logs show that someone with your administrative password accessed the system and altered the recording parameters." Keane's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mr. Keane, I also know about your financial situation and about Dr. Ashford's arrangement with you. I'm not here to judge you or to ensure your prosecution. I'm here to understand the truth about what happened to Dr. Ashford." Keane sat down heavily in his office chair. For a long moment he said nothing, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Dr. Ashford told me to modify the security system," he said. "He wanted to create a situation where Sarah Chen would appear to be the only person working on her robot during the evening before the competition. He said he had a plan to make certain modifications to the robot that would—" I didn't ask too many questions. I needed the money. My debts were destroying my life. "And did Dr. Ashford explain why he wanted these modifications?" Miss Marple asked gently. "He said he was going to patent Sarah's design and frame her for some kind of sabotage if she tried to challenge him. He wanted the security footage to show that she had been the only one with access to the robot. He was going to alter some other documentation to make it look like she had made the dangerous electrical modifications herself." Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery beginning to tighten, but something was still not quite right. "Mr. Keane, did Dr. Ashford ever specifically mention that the electrical modifications would be lethal? Did he explicitly state that he was planning to kill himself?" "What? No, of course not," Keane said, looking genuinely shocked. "That doesn't make any sense. Why would he plan his own murder?" Miss Marple excused herself from the technology office and found Inspector Raymond, to whom she related Keene's confession and the information she had uncovered. Raymond's expression grew increasingly thoughtful as she spoke. So, Dr. Ashford orchestrated the security, camera modification, and implicated Sarah in what he intended to be a sabotage scenario, Raymond said slowly. He was planning to patent her design, and if she objected, he would claim she had attempted to sabotage the competition by tampering with her own robot. Precisely, Miss Marple said, but he did not account for the possibility that someone else might have learned about his plans and decided that a lethal modification would serve them far better than simple sabotage. Chapter 7. The Confidant's Confession. The revelation of Dr. Ashford's manipulation of the security system shifted the focus of the investigation considerably. If Dr. Ashford had himself arranged for the security camera to record only Sarah's actions, then his intention had been to frame her for sabotage. This meant that anyone who learned of his plan might have seen an opportunity to accomplish what many of his victims had probably fantasized about doing, making him pay for his thefts and exploitation. Miss Marple spent the evening reviewing her notes on all the people who had been aware of Dr. Ashford's intellectual property thefts. There was Marcus Webb, the student whose design had been stolen years ago. There was Sarah Chen herself, who had been deceived and was about to lose her scholarship. There was Dr. Patricia Owens, who had confronted Dr. Ashford about the suspicious patterns in his patents, and had been planning to report him to authorities and the Engineering Ethics Board. But there was one person she had not yet fully investigated, Dr. Ashford's wife, Catherine Ashford. Mrs. Ashford was a woman in her early 50s, who had largely remained in the background throughout the competition. She had attended the opening ceremony and the tragic final judgment, but she had said little to anyone. She lived in a comfortable home according to Miss Marple's subtle inquiries that had been paid for almost entirely from Dr. Ashford's patent licensing fees. Miss Marple requested an interview with Mrs. Ashford at her home, and after expressing her condolences, she began asking careful questions about Dr. Ashford's recent behaviour. Mrs. Ashford, I'm curious about your husband's state of mind in the weeks before the robotics competition, Miss Marple began. Did he seem troubled or anxious about anything? Catherine Ashford was a handsome woman who had aged gracefully but whose eyes held a deep sadness that suggested a long marriage that had not been particularly happy. Dr. Ashford was always anxious about something, Mrs. Ashford said. He was obsessed with success, with accumulating money and status. It was exhausting to be married to someone so driven by greed. Were you aware of the nature of his patent business? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Ashford met her eyes. Yes, I knew. I knew he was stealing from his students. I knew he was exploiting young people who trusted him. I confronted him about it multiple times, begged him to stop, but he would just laugh and say that the students were lucky to have him as a mentor and that if they wanted to protect their designs, they should have learned about intellectual property law. That must have been very difficult for you, Miss Marple observed. It was, Mrs. Ashford admitted. But what was more difficult was watching the effect it had on the students. Sarah Chen came to our house once looking for Dr. Ashford. She was crying because her scholarship had been revoked. She was completely broken by the situation. Jonathan he dismissed her concerns. He said that her design was really his, that she was merely the instrument through which his genius manifested itself. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Ashford, when did you learn about Dr. Ashford's plan to frame Sarah Chen for sabotaging her own robot? Catherine Ashford's expression changed, becoming careful and controlled. I don't know what you mean, she said. I believe you do, Miss Marple said gently. I believe that Dr. Ashford confided his plan to you, perhaps in a moment of triumph, expecting you to appreciate his cleverness in how he was going to use the framed sabotage to both claim Sarah's design and destroy her credibility. Catherine Ashford was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow. Yes, he told me. He came home 2 days before the competition and explained exactly what he was going to do. He had already arranged with that man in the technology office to modify the security system. He had already decided how he was going to patent Sarah's design and make millions more, and he was genuinely proud of himself for having orchestrated such a clever plan. And how did you feel about this plan? Miss Marple asked. I felt sick, Mrs. Ashford said. I felt like I was living in a house with a monster, but I also felt powerless. What could I do? Go to the authorities? Report my own husband? He would have denied it all, and even if they had investigated, they likely would have concluded that intellectual property matters were civil rather than criminal. Did you take any action regarding his plan? Miss Marple pressed. Catherine Ashford's hands trembled. I told someone. I told Marcus Webb. He was tutoring our son in mathematics, and he came to the house one evening while Jonathan was away. Marcus asked me if I knew what was happening with the robotics program. He was clearly upset about something. I told him everything. I told him about Jonathan's thefts, about the plan to frame Sarah, all of it. And how did Marcus respond? Miss Marple asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. He was furious. He said that he had already lost his own design to Jonathan years ago, and he couldn't bear the thought of another student suffering the same fate. He said he was going to do something about it, though he wouldn't tell me what. Miss Marple sat back, the final pieces of the puzzle, beginning to fall into place. Marcus Webb, the student who had been victimized by Dr. Ashford years ago, who had seen his design stolen and had been unable to obtain justice through proper channels. Marcus Webb, who had access to the school, who understood robotics and circuitry, who had been in the school on the evening in question. Chapter 8. The Technical Revelation. Miss Marple immediately reported her conversation with Catherine Ashford to Inspector Raymond, and the investigator brought Marcus Webb in for questioning with renewed focus. At first, Marcus maintained his innocence, repeating his earlier claims that he had been in the engineering lab, working on his own project, and had not gone to the gymnasium. But when Raymond presented him with the evidence from Catherine Ashford's statement, when he explained that they now understood the full scope of Dr. Ashford's plan to frame Sarah Chen, when he detailed the vulnerability of Marcus's own situation regarding his stolen design, the young man finally broke down. I didn't plan to kill him, Marcus said, his voice cracking with emotion. I swear to you, I never intended for that to happen. Then tell us what did happen, Inspector Raymond said, his tone becoming somewhat gentler. I was angry, Marcus began, his words coming in a rush. When Mrs. Ashford told me about the plan to frame Sarah, something snapped inside me. I had already lost so much because of Dr. Ashford. My design, my reputation, my self-confidence. I watched him get away with theft year after year, and no one did anything about it. And now he was going to do the same thing to Sarah, and probably to others after her. So you went to the gymnasium that evening, Raymond prompted. Yes, I went there around 8 o'clock after the main building had mostly emptied out. I knew Sarah had been working on her robot earlier. I thought maybe I could somehow disable the robot systems in a way that would prevent Dr. Ashford from being able to examine it properly, maybe create some kind of short circuit or power failure that would make the robot inoperable. But that's not what you did, Miss Marple said quietly from the observation room where she was listening to the interrogation. Is it, Marcus? Marcus looked up, meeting her eyes through the one-way glass, though she knew he couldn't actually see her. His expression was one of anguish and resignation. I accessed the robot's electrical systems, Marcus continued. I had the knowledge to do it. I understood how Sarah had designed her power distribution circuit, but I made a critical error. I had studied a diagram of the secondary power system, the way it had been originally designed, not the way Sarah had actually modified it for the competition. When I made my modifications, I didn't realize I was introducing a lethal voltage issue. I thought I was just creating a malfunction that would require the robot to be withdrawn from the competition. But you created something far more dangerous, Miss Marple observed, speaking now directly to Marcus rather than to Inspector Raymond. You created a system that would deliver lethal electrical current to anyone who made direct contact with the robot's external chassis, and you did this in a way that would implicate Sarah Chen as the person responsible for the sabotage. I didn't realize, Marcus said, tears streaming down his face. I swear to God, I didn't realize that the modifications I was making would be lethal. If I had known, I would never have done it. I was angry, yes, but I didn't want to kill anyone. I just wanted to stop Dr. Ashford from exploiting another student. But when Dr. Ashford touched the robot the next morning, he died, Raymond said. And because of the way you had modified the security system, the evidence all pointed to Sarah Chen. "I know," Marcus said, his voice breaking, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't confess without explaining how I knew about the security system modifications and Dr. Ashford's plan, and I knew that if I confessed, Sarah would be exonerated, but I would go to prison. So I stayed silent, and I let her take the blame. In the observation room, Miss Marple felt a profound sadness settle over her. Marcus Webb was not an evil person. She understood that immediately. He was a young man who had been wronged, who had been pushed to the edge of his emotional resources by years of injustice, and who, in a moment of anger and poor judgment, had inadvertently committed a tragedy. The modifications he had made to the robot's electrical system, she now understood, had been crude, not because he lacked the technical knowledge, but because he had been working from incomplete and outdated information. If he had had access to Sarah's actual design specifications, he likely would have made more elegant and less lethal modifications. But in trying to work in secret, in trying not to damage Sarah's actual design, he had made errors that had fatal consequences. Chapter 9. The Hidden Manuscript. With Marcus Webb's confession, the immediate legal question regarding Dr. Ashford's death should have been resolved. Sarah Chen was exonerated and released from suspicion, but Miss Marple found herself continuing to investigate, driven by a sense that there was still something important she did not fully understand. She returned to examining Dr. Ashford's personal papers and digital files, this time with a focus not on his patent applications and licensing agreements, but on his personal correspondence and notes. What she discovered was revelatory. Dr. Ashford had kept a detailed journal on his personal computer, a journal in which he documented not just his financial transactions, but also his psychological justifications for his theft. He wrote about how he deserved recognition for the guidance he provided to his students, how the designs were essentially products of the robotics program environment he had created, rather than purely the work of individual students. He documented his awareness that what he was doing was wrong, but he rationalized it as being a form of compensation for the emotional labor he provided and the opportunities he afforded to his students. But there was one entry that particularly struck Miss Marple, dated just 1 week before the robotics competition. In it, Dr. Ashford wrote about his growing paranoia that his scheme was about to be exposed. He mentioned Dr. Patricia Owens's questions about the suspicious patterns in his patents. He mentioned that he suspected at least one student, Marcus Webb, had figured out the truth. He wrote about his plan to frame Sarah Chen as a way of preemptively eliminating potential threats to his operation. But most disturbingly, he wrote about his growing awareness that Catherine had discovered the truth about his activities, and that she was not simply disapproving, but actively disgusted by him. He wrote about how he was using the Sarah Chen plan as a way of demonstrating to his wife that he was not merely a criminal, but a brilliant criminal, someone whose schemes were clever and sophisticated enough to warrant her respect, if not her affection. This final detail struck Miss Marple with particular force. Dr. Ashford had not simply been stealing designs out of greed or ambition. He had been seeking validation and respect from a wife who had long since lost any respect for him. His increasing boldness and criminality had been driven not just by financial incentives, but by a desperate need to demonstrate his intellectual superiority and cleverness. When Miss Marple shared these discoveries with Catherine Ashford in a second interview, the widow's expression transformed from careful composure to something rawer and more honest. "I should have left him," Catherine said quietly. "Long ago. When I first realized what he was doing, I should have walked away instead of trying to reform him or to accept his behavior as somehow my responsibility to endure. And maybe if I had left, Marcus Webb would never have confronted the situation, and Dr. Ashford would still be alive." "That's not true," Miss Marple said gently. Dr. Ashford's actions set in motion a chain of consequences that were beyond anyone's ability to prevent at that point. You are not responsible for his death or for Marcus Webb's actions. Yet even as she said this, Miss Marple understood the terrible interconnectedness of human choices and their consequences. Dr. Ashford had stolen Marcus Webb's design years ago. This theft had created a reservoir of anger and injustice in Marcus that festered for years. When Marcus learned of Dr. Ashford's plan to victimize another student, that old anger combined with his protective instincts in a tragic way. Dr. Ashford had created the conditions for his own death through his years of exploitation and theft. Chapter 10. The final understanding. The conclusion of the robotics competition investigation brought a complex resolution that satisfied no one completely, but was perhaps the most honest outcome possible under the circumstances. Marcus Webb was charged with involuntary manslaughter, a charge that reflected the reality that while he had created the lethal modification, he had not intended to kill anyone. Sarah Chen was fully exonerated, and her scholarship was restored. Dr. Ashford's stolen designs were investigated by the appropriate authorities, and procedures were put in place to ensure that his patents would be challenged and likely invalidated. The students from whose work he had profited would likely receive some recompense, though the legal processes for such recompense were complex and slow. On the final afternoon of the robotics competition, after all the official proceedings had concluded, Miss Marple sat alone in the gymnasium where the tragedy had occurred. The robots had been removed, the crime scene markers taken down, and the space had been restored to its original appearance as a school gymnasium. It seemed almost impossible that such momentous events had unfolded here, that a man had died, and the lives of several young people had been forever altered. She was sitting quietly, her knitting needles clicking in their familiar rhythm, when Sarah Chen entered the gymnasium. The young woman approached Miss Marple hesitantly, as though uncertain of her welcome. "Miss Marple, I wanted to thank you," Sarah said, "for believing in me when everyone else was convinced of my guilt, for finding the truth." Miss Marple set down her knitting and smiled at the girl with genuine warmth. "Sarah, I never truly believed you guilty. I have spent a lifetime observing human nature in all its complexity, and I have learned to trust my observations. You are not a person capable of deliberately creating a lethal device, regardless of your justifications for doing so." "But Marcus is," Sarah said quietly, "even though he didn't mean to kill anyone." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Marcus is a person capable of making desperate choices in moments of anger and desperation. But that does not make him an evil person. He was wronged by Dr. Ashford, as you were wronged by Dr. Ashford. But whereas you chose to continue your design work and to pursue justice through proper channels, Marcus chose to act in anger. Both of you are victims of Dr. Ashford's predatory behavior, though your victimhood took different forms." Sarah sat down beside Miss Marple, and they sat together in companionable silence for a few minutes. "Do you think justice has been served?" Sarah asked finally. Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "I think that justice, true justice, requires that the guilty be held accountable and the innocent be protected. Dr. Ashford has paid the ultimate price, though not in a way anyone would have chosen. Marcus Webb will likely face significant consequences for his actions, but the courts may be merciful given the circumstances. You have been exonerated, and your future restored. I suppose that is as close to justice as we can achieve in a complex and broken world." "What will happen to Marcus now?" Sarah asked. "He will face trial," Miss Marple replied. "The outcome depends on many factors: the quality of his legal representation, the judge who is assigned to the case, the degree of compassion the legal system is capable of showing. But I suspect that his youth, his lack of prior criminal record, and the mitigating circumstances of the case will all factor into whatever sentence he receives." As Sarah left the gymnasium to return to her life, Miss Marple continued her knitting, the needles moving in their steady, practiced rhythm. The pattern she was creating was one of considerable complexity, with multiple strands of different colours interweaving in an intricate design. It struck her that human lives were much like this pattern, each individual strand meaningful in its own right, but true understanding required seeing how all the strands interconnected, how each choice and action reverberated through the larger tapestry of human experience. Dr. Ashford had pursued success at the cost of exploiting others. Marcus Webb had sought justice through violence rather than patience. Sarah Chen had persevered in the face of theft and injustice. Catherine Ashford had silently endured a marriage to someone she could not respect. All of them were connected by threads of theft, anger, betrayal, and ultimately, tragedy. As twilight gathered over Lakewood Heights High School, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and prepared to return to her quiet life in St. Mary Mead. The robotics competition would eventually be restored, and would continue without the taint of the tragedy that had unfolded during this particular year. The school would move forward, the students would graduate, and life would continue in the way that life does, with new dramas and mysteries and human complexities waiting around every corner. But for now, in this moment of quiet reflection in an empty gymnasium, Miss Marple understood once again what she had learned so many times before in her long life: that human nature was endlessly complex and endlessly tragic. That people who committed crimes were rarely simply evil, but were usually people caught in webs of their own making, responding to pressures and injustices in ways that made sense to them in the moment, even if those responses led to catastrophe. And that the most important tool for understanding human darkness was not judgment, but compassion coupled with clear observation of the facts. As she left the gymnasium, Miss Marple murmured to herself the same meditation she had repeated countless times in countless circumstances. "We are all capable of crime," she said softly to the empty evening. "We are all capable of both tremendous kindness and tremendous cruelty. The difference between the victim and the perpetrator is often simply circumstance and opportunity, not some fundamental moral difference." And with that understanding, Miss Marple stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving behind the gymnasium and its secrets, carrying with her the knowledge that truth, however difficult and complicated, was always preferable to comfortable illusion. Thank you for listening to this mystery brought to you by Mindful Musings and narrated through the observant eyes of Miss Marple. The threads of human nature, once pulled, reveal patterns both beautiful and terrible. Until next time, dear listeners, may you find wisdom in observation and clarity in truth. This has been William, your guide through the mysteries of Mindful Musings. The end.